It's been a mixed week for Nigel Farage and Reform. A record-busting £9 million donation, plus defections from the Conservative Party. But that combined with some controversial comments of things that Nigel Farage was allegedly making back in his days at Dulwich College has made it perhaps a more tetchy time for the Reform leader than he's experienced in the past. Meanwhile, the government has turned its attention to welfare reform once again, with Pat McFadden outlining some changes he wishes to introduce as the Welfare and Pensions Minister next year. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
So welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, joined as ever by Joe Phillips and fortunately Jim Hancock, who has had at least 20 minutes of technical difficulties, unable to hear us. We thought it was his computer. Turns out he didn't have his bloody hearing aid switched on. But let's go. And as I mentioned in the introduction there, we're going to talk all things reform. We'll take a look at the Tory revival and Kemi Badenoch's increasingly impressive performances at PMQs and indeed on the media. And then we'll turn our attention to the government, Pat McFadden's announcements over the weekend for potential welfare reform, and lots of talk and rumour of Angela Rayner's potential comeback to the cabinet. So let's start with Nigel Farage then. A mixed week, I would say, for reform. So they received this huge donation of £9 million from a guy who lives abroad, of course, probably a Brexiteer as well, and a cryptocurrency man. So the biggest donation ever given by somebody alive was the headline around that particular donation. They continue to lead in the polls, depending on which polls you read. Some are still putting reform on 30%, others have them now in the mid-20s. But on the poll of polls, I think I read they're on 28%. And then you've had the controversy over remarks that were made, allegedly at least, at Dulwich College by an 18-year-old Nigel Farage, relating to some fairly nasty bullying and racism. So, as I say, bit of a mixed week for reform. And it seems to me, Joe, and you know him better than Jim or I, because of course you share a television platform with him on a weekly basis on GB News. He seemed rather rattled by the Dulwich College revelations, and he took to the stage to make this rather bizarre attack on It Ain't Half Optimal and one or two other BBC television programmes from the 70s. It seems to me, Joe, that he's taken a lesson from the Labour Party's communications team, because he wasn't his usual suave self in dealing with these controversies. And I think he's dug a bit of a hole for himself.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, none of these allegations are new. They first surfaced in 2013. They were in a book that Michael Crick wrote and published in 2021. So they've been doing the rounds for a long, long time. And, in a sense, you can say, which is what he said at the beginning, I might have said things that I regret when I was a teenager, blah, de, blah, de, blah. What he didn't say at the time was that if I offended anybody, I'm sorry. But he could have done, and it would have moved on. But what he's done is changed and doubled down from saying, well, I don't remember, I was just a kid, to I categorically deny. Now, there are several things here which I think are quite interesting. One is, as you say, Frank, we have seen the very thin skin of Nigel Farage getting rattled and needled And we've heard, his Lieutenant Richard Tice saying this is a load of made-up twaddle, which is absolutely ridiculous. There's another thing that, Nigel Farage is the only person who can apply to have his school records from Dulwich College. And he could apply for that. Because if you're going to say, I categorically deny it, then prove it. Because there would be school records if it was, as it was claimed, he set fire to the school roll because it had more Patels than Smiths, or if anyone had ever made a complaint about him, or in fact he'd been suspended for bad behaviour or racist behaviour. He has apparently chosen not to do that. And what we've seen, very unusually, is that as he unveiled the latest defector, someone you've never heard of, in Scotland, Farage disappeared and wouldn't take questions from the press. So I think that is showing a side of him that, many people know has always been there, but the general public perhaps haven't seen that. They've seen the jolly, bonhomie, brush it aside sort of thing. So he's clearly rattled. This whole thing about the crypto, the one thing I would say is I think the Labour Party are being absolutely stupid, concentrating on what Nigel Farage might have said 49 years ago. Concentrate on what Reform are doing now. Concentrate on the real issues about how they're failing in Kent and other local authorities. Look at the funding, as you say, Frank, 9 million quid from a bloke with a Thai passport who doesn't even live in this country, and cryptocurrency that Nigel Farage has promoted, very openly and been paid for. So there are much bigger questions than what he may or may not have said nearly 50 years ago.
Yeah, and of course, you've also got these Russian links, which have not been scrutinised as much as we anticipated they would be once his colleague, I think his name's Gill, wasn't it, who admitted to collaboration with the Russians and has ended up in jail. And the idea that a former Labour, Tory or Liberal Democrat politician will be able to get away with that without the scrutiny of the party, far more so than we've seen with Reform, is for the birds, really. It does amaze me, Jim, how poor the opposition parties and the media have been in nailing down some of these issues and really making the criticism stick, because, as Joe rightly says, okay, this has been an embarrassment for Farage, and it is apparently cutting through with some of those middle-class voters who perhaps have said Reform in a poll, but still would only vote that way holding the nose. So these sort of remarks do matter, whether they were made 40-odd years ago or not. Nonetheless, Jo is quite right, isn't she, in saying that there are some bigger issues that the opposition parties should be concentrating on. The other thing I'd say, Jim, and this is a broader point, isn't it time we looked at political donations in the round? Because for somebody to be able to throw £9 million from Thailand into an election campaign, because this money will be used, don't forget, Scottish, Welsh elections coming up in May and lots of local elections as well. Talk about being able to subvert the democratic process from afar. It's bloody ridiculous, isn't it?
Yes, I need to check this, but I thought some rules had been brought in about foreign donations, that people who are not resident in this country and are not voting and participating can dictate to some extent our political fortunes by making donations abroad, leave alone the scale of this donation. Forgive me, I'd need to check it, but I mean, I wonder whether this is, this guy wants to do it, and some organisation, the Electoral Commission or somebody, are going to come in and veto it, because I'm sure that there was a big row about this some years ago about foreign donations. But, because, of course, in the United States, they did scrap the rules and allowed a free-for-all in terms of donations. And we've seen what's happened as a result. It's just a ridiculous arms race between the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, the Democrats take huge donations as well. It's the money that's raised to fight American elections, even by failed presidential candidates. It was obscene. scale, and just all it does is just bombard people every night on the televisions endlessly with adverts. They get fed up with it. So we've seen the playbook in the United States, and I may be entirely wrong about this, but I'm not sure that Mr. Farage can be. Sorry, Joe, have you got a thought on it?
I'm just looking it up on the House of Commons library here. And the basic answer is foreign donations are banned under UK electoral law. But but parties can accept donations or loans with no upper limit if they come from a permissible source. Foreign nationals are not included. Now, this chap, although he lives in Thailand and has got a Thai passport, I presume has got British nationality.
He's got a UK passport.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's the way they get round it.
Yeah.
Sometimes, isn't there another clause that says if the donor has business interests in the UK?
If the donor is an individual registered in a UK electoral register, including overseas electors, or a UK registered company or a trade union or an unincorporated association or a limited liability partnership. So, I mean, there are ways around this, and I would have thought that this particular chap would have looked at all of that. But if he's got British citizenship as well as a top,
there'll be loopholes galore for this guy.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I think the wider issue is, though, and Labour and the Liberal Democrats in particular need to look at themselves. Both have had ample opportunity over the years to sort this out, and they've always shied away from it because, of course, when the Conservatives were in coalition with the Liberal Democrats were able to attract lots of interest in terms of donors, and so when you have the power to do something about this, you tend not to. Labour, for 14 years, were in government and didn't address this issue either. And chickens are coming home to roost. The other thing that I thought was strange a couple of weeks ago now was when this issue arose with Gill, and it's Gill, isn't it? The guy.
Yeah, Nathan Gill.
Gill. And then there was another colleague who now, again, bizarrely, another Brexiteer who lives in a chateau in France these days. Amazing how anti-European these people are, really, isn't it? And yet they all bugger off to France. Andrew Neil's another one, isn't he? Living over in France and a big Brexiteer, the twat. Anyway, so you have all of this going on in terms of Russian links with the Reform Party, and Starmer says Reform should have an investigation into Russian links. Why don't the government launch an investigation into Russian links? Again, you don't have to focus on Reform. You've had this problem with the Chinese espionage and Chinese influence in Parliament. You've had other MPs getting caught up with different countries across the globe. You could easily say we're going to launch an independent inquiry through Parliament, not one of these stupid things that cost hundreds of millions of pounds and take years to report back on, and take in the issue of Reform's links with Russia. These are the things that I think opposition parties are missing the goal by an absolute mile. Honestly, Jim, it's driving me mad.
Yes, I wonder whether it's partly because people and the parallels of what's going on in America are very, very clear. I mean, you're talking about Farage having a thin skin, just like Trump does, and the Russian, the strange attitude to Russia, same as Trump. And the third parallel, which comes to your point, is that are we in a state of play where it's the famous, I could go out and Trump saying I could go out in the street and shoot someone, they'd still vote for me. Are the British people in a position where either they wouldn't care about the results of the sort of investigation that you're talking about, or that they would see it as persecution of Nigel Farage because he's got the right message? And this also goes to the Jewish thing. It's an awful thing to think about, but that people just are in a mood not to care about all these things. And whilst both of you are right that it should be investigated more rigorously, don't hold your breath that it's going to make a difference to Reform. One last thing, what I think you've also hinted at, what would be something that both the Conservative, particularly the Conservatives actually, but Labour as well, could focus on is reform and the economy. Because when people are asked about competence, I think the Conservatives now have a little bit of distance lead on reform on the economy. And I think the opposition should particularly bear down on that, because nobody can complain about that. Whereas with the other things, you're absolutely right about Russia and anti-Semitism in his youth, absolutely right. But, you know, the slight danger is, I don't want to sound sort of like a pathetic wimp about it. The danger is it's just seen as persecuting Nigel. So I really think do those other things, of course, but let's focus on their economic proposals, because they don't stand up to any scrutiny at all.
Well,
I think
just to
sorry,
confirm
Joe,
that.
just before I bring you back in, I mean, I would say, Jim, that this is the problem in terms of the Democrats and Trump. They didn't go after him on things like that because they said, well, people won't care. Well, how do we know? Unless we highlight and focus on these things, we can have this attitude of, well, nobody really cares and nobody's listening. I'm sure you're right in terms of the reform base, but the reform base, I would suggest, is probably about 15 to 20%. There's still a significant number of people out there who don't scrutinise the news in the way in which we do, who won't have even heard of Nathan Gill. And in the absence of the media taking these issues seriously, and I would have to accept the government and the other opposition parties not focusing on these issues as much as they ought, then how are they ever going to find out? And I would simply say that if there was an inquiry, it ought to be broad. I mean, we should be concerned about the amount of foreign influence that is coming into British politics, not simply through reform. This donation is another great example of that. But look at the bloody carry on from Musk and the sort of stuff he's been putting out on social media. Look at the things that have happened with China and these three guys who were up in court and it didn't subsequently go to trial. There'd be Labour MPs in trouble, there's Liberal Democrat MPs in trouble. So it is something that we ought to be taking more seriously. Let's not forget, we also think, in fact, we know, don't we, there's Russian interference in our electoral system and certainly Russian interference in the Brexit referendum. So this is a much bigger issue than simply reform. I think it would just add to the fact that reform are not our friends.
I think you're right, Frank, and I think there are, the huge row and the huge mistake that Keir Starmer made in taking the donations of clothes, spectacles, and all of that stuff, the hospitality that all MPs and cabinet and shadow cabinet ministers take and then get pilloried for. And we do need, and you could do it really quickly. You have a parliamentary inquiry, because it's not just about donations in hard currency, it's also about cryptocurrency, this is, as far as I know, the first time that there's been a cryptocurrency thing, which is notoriously impossible to explain, even though my grandson did try. But it's also impossible to trace. So, there's that. There's also the whole thing about gifts, and there's, the question about pay and what have you, and perks, and, there's MPs who are claiming second home allowance when actually they live in commuting distance of the House of Commons and all of those things. And I actually think, no, we need to do it. The government, Labour, in its manifesto promised to clean up politics. Well, now's your opportunity. And if it doesn't come now, after the collapse of the China spy trial and the report into the Skripal-Salisbury poisonings, then when is the better time to do it? And I would just say, I think you're also right on the economy. Just bear in mind, for those of you that don't follow events in Kent as closely as I do, they have just confirmed in post, probably an excellent woman as a chief executive, but her salary is £269,000 a year. Now that, by anybody's standards is quite a lot. If that was a Labour council, it would be all over the Mail and the Telegraph and, twice what the Prime Minister gets. This is a reform-run county council who have made that choice to confirm that person in position.
Yeah, I think there's lots of things to go at in terms of reform, and it's one of the things that I'm sure Kemi Badenoch and her team are looking at with some glee, because Labour won't necessarily be the beneficiaries of a reform collapse. Kemi Badenoch improved performance in terms of her leadership. I think it's fair to say since the conference speech that she made, which we all agreed was a very good speech, helped, aided and abetted massively by the government's continued missteps, of course, because that's given us some room, some space to get involved in the conversation. And then Jim's mate, Simel Stride, has been able to outline their economic plans, which, as you say, Jim, have started to get some traction with the electorate as well. So, James, the Conservatives on the way back, you think?
Well, it's early days yet, but there was a lot of controversy about Kemi Badenoch's very personal attack on the Chancellor in the budget, but I did think it was highly personal. But nevertheless, it's good for the troops. It rallies the morale of the Conservative Party, and so there is some sign of that. I mean, the main thing that might help them is that if they can make this sort of benefit street tag work, then that might actually give them some traction, because people will then see, because there is going to be, and we may come on to this in relation to what the Work and Pension Secretary announced yesterday, a big battle and a big discussion about welfare benefits, the cost of them, and the really tricky thing about actually tagging people that say they've got mental illness and somebody saying to them, well, I don't think so. And, if I had to sum it up, that's going to be the contact point. Now, the Conservatives, Laura Trott, their spokesperson yesterday, they seem to be going down that, I won't call it courageous, because that will offend a lot of people. But, home truths and straight talking and a real debate about this might help the Conservatives to regain some traction. But, apropos our previous conversation, they still obviously have a problem with reform. But in a way, I think we probably agree, don't we, all of us, that they're almost not going to win against reform on immigration. That's Farage's thing. And the more we can get onto the economy, which, should, once again, unless the British people have completely lost their minds, should be the central issue at the next general election, then the Conservative Party can gain some traction as a result.
And I think Kemi Badenoch did start to map that strategy out for the Conservatives in her conference speech. She wants to be talking less about these woke issues, less about immigration, because, as you say, Jim, however tough any of the other parties look, Reform are always going to say, well, we go further still. The Tories are not going to go near, let's send them all home, wherever home is. They're not going to go down the ICE route unless Jenrick takes over the leadership, in which case all better off. There has, of course, also been some talk, and Farage raised this himself, didn't he, in the private conversation, apparently, with some donors, of a merger or a deal of some sort, a pact of some sort. And I'm not convinced that would do them a great deal of good, Joe. But what do you think? Politically, would that make sense, or would they end up in a similar situation to the old Social Democrat Liberal Alliance? You remember, with David Steele in the pocket of David Owen and Farage and Kemi. They don't make obvious bedfellows to me, those two.
No, they don't. And I think, you mentioned Robert Jenrick. Well, there isn't room in the world for Robert Jenrick and Nigel Farage's egos to be in the same place. I think Kemi Badenoch, interestingly, is looking much more comfortable in her own skin. She's sounding, she's never going to sound empathetic and cuddly, or particularly human, but she is sounding much more in control. And I think that obviously gives a boost to her backbenchers. And I think, her performance in the Commons has been much better of late. And I think there is a feeling, and you can't quite put your finger on it, but there is a feeling that, they might be coming back to be credible. And of course, all the time Reform is welcoming all of these failed disgraced, unelected Tory MPs. It's not so much a reverse takeover as, oh, you couldn't get elected for the Tories because everybody thought you were rubbish, so come and join us and we'll give you a different shade of blue T-shirt and then you can pretend you're even more rubbish. I mean, I do think Reform have got a problem because at the moment, they've got one thoughtful person, Danny Kruger, who's, he's a serious man, he's a serious politician. The rest of them are a sort of a ragtag of Andrea Jenkins and Nadine Dorries and Jonathan Gullis. All of these people, if you bumped into them at a bus stop, you wouldn't know who they were. Well, probably Nadine Dorries you would. But so actually, is Reform now beginning to look like just a lot of grumpy ex-Tories rather than a new, and it doesn't look very young either, a new party? And I think, all the things that we've said about Reform and the feelings of that sort of Middle England group who are concerned about immigration but won't be racist are beginning to perhaps think, well, maybe we should give the Tories another chance.
I've always thought that the Conservatives will find a way of staying relevant and being electable once again, because they are, as we know, the most successful bloody political organisation in democracy, in any democracy. So the idea that they were going to die on the basis of a really poor election result, I always thought was a bit of a stretch. But what do you think, Jim, about this potential merger or deal with Reform?
Well, I mean, there have been various signals coming out from Farage because didn't he say that it won't be a merger; it'll be a takeover of the
reverse takeover.
Yeah, the sort of the remnants of the Conservative Party. We shall just mop up. So I think the language at the moment from Farage is quite bullish and not in terms of trying to bring these two parties together, but as Joe has brilliantly illustrated, the difference in some senses, I mean, this is Reform's danger, that they're being sort of diluted, if that's the right word, by these grumpy defectors coming over. I mean, there was there's a chap in Bolton who was a Bolton MP, Chris Green. He defected yesterday, having said he wouldn't do anything of the sort. So, people looking for a complete change who want to see a rejection of the old parties, because that's the big shtick of Reform. We're not like the others, but hang on a minute, you've got lined up in your ranks, Jake Berry and Danny Kruger and this obscure peer from Scotland, and people who might begin to wonder what the difference is. But the language at the moment from Farage seems to be of a takeover of the rubble of the Conservative Party. But I mean, let's just sort of, think forward, and politicians are sometimes expedient. If it begins to look, a bit of a Conservative recovery, so they are somebody that Farage has to respect, that Labour look very vulnerable, the temptation for something will be there. But as Joe and I remember, they're going to get into that awful the seat division between the SDP and the Liberals that Joe and I will remember from the early 1980s, and how incredibly difficult and divisive it was. And also, of course, the British people don't like to be told what to do, by parties sort of cynically standing down necessarily. So we'll have to see. But at the moment, Farage seems to be in a sort of arrogant mood to talk about reverse takeover rather than doing any sort of civilized deal, if that's the right word.
I think if you look at the way the polls have moved over the past couple of months, he shouldn't be that complacent, though, because it is going in one direction, and that's Reform seem to have hit their peak at 30%, which could be good enough in our first past the post system. Interestingly, Nigel Farage doesn't talk about electoral reform as much these days either. So he's obviously fairly confident that they may be able to win on a first past the post election. I think a Tory revival will continue into the new year. We'll do our predictions in a couple of weeks, but I think Emmy Badenoch and Mel Stride, one or two others as well, have started to come to the fore and sound like reasonable politicians again, who are trying to attract not just lunatic right-wing headbangers, but also people who will win an election for you, which is the middle ground of British politics. That is still where elections are to be won and lost. And I think that a merger between those two would potentially help Labour, actually, because I think then you would see people who've scuttled off to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens would say, hang on a minute, we can't be allowing a right-wing party with reforms involvement into government, and so we'll hold our noses and vote for Labour again. So I don't necessarily think a merger is on the cards. I don't think it would be a good idea. In fact, I think it would be a disaster for the Tories in the longer term, in the same way that the coalition didn't work for the Liberal Democrats ultimately. But we will see. I mean, the one final thing I'll say, and I've been very critical of the press, particularly the BBC, in terms of their treatment of reform. Another bloody reform person was on Question Time again. It's just getting nonsensical now. It really is absolutely nuts. However, what I have noticed, and about bloody time too, is that they've started to scrutinise reform in a way that hasn't been the case before. They've almost woken up to the fact that, hang on, these guys are serious and they could potentially be the next government. So we best start asking some questions of the character, the culture, and the nature of this party. And at some point, Jim, you're quite right, their economics are going to be scrutinised as well. And as Zach Polanski found on a recent podcast interview he did with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, if you ain't got your economics right, it can all unravel very, very quickly. Made a bit of prat of himself, I'm afraid, Mr. Polanski, on that podcast. Came away as quite a nice chap, but equally somebody who didn't have a bleeding clue about the economy. So I think the more we can get into our journalists, our media, scrutinise reform in the right way, then the more that is likely to unravel. And as I say, I think the Conservative revival is something that will continue into the new year. Right, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be turning our attention to the government, and we'll be looking at some of the statements that the Work and Pensions Minister, Pat McFadden, made over the weekend, and these continued rumours of Angela Rayner's return to the Cabinet. Stick with us. We'll be back in a mo as Jim goes to recharge his batteries on his hearing aid. Okay, welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. I think we may have recorded some of the conversation that we were having in the break, and if so, it'll make a great Christmas special, because Jim and Joe were regaling us with some fabulous tales from their time in the press gallery in the Common. I'm not sure whether it's publishable, to be honest. But anyway, let's move on and get back to the politics and to the Labour Party and the government. I was at a reception this week in London and enjoyed the company of many ministers and MPs. Wes Streeting among them, who was in fine form. He was the main speaker at the event that we went to, of probably around 50 or 60 Labour donors, lots of MPs in the room, a lot of staffers. It was the sort of Christmas get-together for those Labour staunch supporters who have stuck with the government through thin and thin, and were all sort of bemoaning the fact that they've done a lot of good things but have been unable to get their message across. Wes Street, I have to say, again, made an excellent speech, and a few of the business people in the room were saying surely it's when, not if, he's going to become Prime Minister. But of course, there are one or two other people who will have different thinking around that particular issue. One of the things that Labour failed miserably to get a grip of in its first 18 months of office has been welfare, and the bill is spiralling to the point by 2030 the welfare bill will be £400 billion. Now that is simply not sustainable. And so we are, I think, expecting Pat McFadden, who is now the Work and Pensions Secretary, to come forward with a range of fairly radical proposals in the new year in the hope that he can get his Labour backbenchers on side. Now, I'm not sure if we saw his round on the news media yesterday. He's not the most cheerful of guys in the run-up to Christmas, is Pat, but he's a very effective minister, Jim. And my sense is that unlike Liz Kendall, who held that post last year, he's rolling the pitch. He'll be having the conversations. He's a very canny parliamentary operator, and he, alongside with the new Chief Whip, Johnny Reynolds, will be making the necessary phone calls, setting out the case, and I suspect those changes and reforms will get the amount of support that is required. What is your thinking, young James?
Young James with a hearing difficulty, you really must decide the accuracy of your attack. Obviously, what you're talking about is the announcement of this youth guarantee that young people on benefit will be offered job opportunities in things like construction and hospitality. And what was interesting in the interview was the what if they don't respond to this, and whether there's going to be a real squeeze on their benefits if they are indicated to be, to use an old-fashioned expression, swinging the lead. I mean, that's the crunch of it. But you make I think, a very good point that, the Parliamentary Labour Party embarrassed the government big time last summer on the welfare reforms. And with Pat McFadden's skills and Johnny Reynolds, who I think was shamefully sacked as business secretary, perhaps, this will be an opportunity for him to use his undoubted political skills, which I think he has, in my opinion. Good friend of Downtown, came to a reception with us last year.
He was not sacked, James. He was moved to another job.
Yes, well, if you're spending too much time at these Labour donor reception, by the way, that's an interesting echo on a conversation before the break. But anyway, we mustn't get into a fight, Frank. We love each other very much. What is actually going to happen? And I do think that they've used up their capital and they would not want to embarrass the government, providing it is well structured. That's what I was told by a pretty senior Northwest Labour backbencher when I said, the party is the parliamentary party is just irreconcilably against welfare reform. A lot of them know they're only going to be there for one term, so they might as well display their socialist credentials and go down in flames. I was told that wasn't the case. Well, we'll soon have an acid test of this, but it's still going to be subject to attack. The Conservatives hit back again yesterday, saying it wasn't enough. But when they were challenged about what they actually meant, talking about getting your figures together, Laura Trott didn't have her figures together, and it was demolished by Ms. Kunzberg. So it's a real battleground area. This, but the message is that, signing people off on benefits on the basis of either a face-to-face meeting, if you're lucky, or possibly doing it online or on the phone, saying, I'm just not feeling up to it, and consigning the rest of your life to being on benefits. I think that message will resonate with people. It's not a heartless thing, but that the government are getting alongside people. But it's a question of how determined Pat McFadden is, how much support he will ultimately get from the Prime Minister for what he's doing, and we'll see how it develops in the new year.
Oh, I don't think you can ever doubt Pat McFadden's determination, James. I think he will be very determined to get these measures through. As I say, I think he'll succeed, because I think there is a recognition within the majority of the PLP. You're always going to have people on the left who won't support any sort of changes to the benefit system unless the bill is going up. But I think there is a recognition when you talk to reasonable Labour MPs, of which the majority are of that ilk, you cannot say that offering somebody with anxiety and mental health issues a life at home on benefits is the way in which to get them better, to get them back integrated into society. And there has to be some carrot and stick with this. I think one of the things that Rachel Reeves said in the budget perhaps didn't make enough of was the announcement that people who are going to claim such benefits in future will have to have a face-to-face interview with GPs. I think I mentioned in the podcast a week or so ago, it was the one time when Mel Stride looked very, very embarrassed because he was the guy who signed off on the fact that people could just fill in these daft online forms to get signed off sick. So, the Tories are on a little bit of shaky ground there. I do think, though, in terms of the wider narrative, Joe, Labour are going to have to come up with a better story, because the Benefit Street thing is working for Kemi Badenoch. She's gone out at the weekend again and, as Jim said, attacked the Labour Party, the government, for not doing enough. That may work, certainly in the short term. I tell you where I'd be a bit fearful of us, the Conservatives. This total anti-lifting of the two-child benefit cap, because by the time of the next election, projections are that 300 to 350,000 kids will have been lifted out of poverty. And economically, the government will be able to start to map out the benefits to society at that point, not just terms in health, educational attainment and other things as well. I think if the Tories box themselves in too tightly on that, that might come back to bite them. But equally, Labour have got to start to get their story a little bit better. And again, as I said recently on a podcast, stop going after the hearts and flowers argument on two-child benefit caps, and indeed on the mental health issue. Start getting real in terms of the economics. That's where Labour should be going with its welfare reforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this goes back to something that we've talked about before on this podcast, which is the problem of whoever is Chancellor, whatever political party they're from, the OBR forecasts are so short term. And when you're talking about poverty, you're actually looking at 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the future. So the long-term benefits of getting people off welfare and into work are so enormous for all the reasons that you've outlined, Frank. But it doesn't come on its own. It goes alongside good quality housing, access to healthcare, all of those sort of things. It does need reform of the special education needs schooling system, which again has allowed desperate people to go down that route because they're stuck perhaps in terrible temporary accommodation. And of course, it's having an impact on the children's health and welfare. So there are many, many things. None of it comes as a sort of, oh, it's a one-off, we're going to cut this. The stuff the government's announced is fine, but it's piddly. 50,000 apprenticeships in the hospitality industry. What is one of the industries that has been hit hardest by the national insurance hike? Hospitality. Where is it hardest to get work? In places like coastal areas, seaside and tourist places, for all sorts of reasons. So you're going to make people take apprenticeships in jobs that don't exist. And the other thing about the sanctions on young people who refuse to take any apprenticeship and the new apprenticeship scheme, after they've been on benefits for 18 months. 18 months is too long to be on benefits. Yeah. You need to do it at the beginning. You need to get people into work really quickly, even if it is a paid voluntary thing. Go and work in a food bank, go and work in a charity shop, whatever it is. But you can't leave people, particularly young people, languishing for 18 months before you then begin what will inevitably be a really slow process of finding some poor hapless employer will go, yeah, okay, so what have you been doing for the last 18 months? With TikTok. I mean, it's not going to work, is it? There's got to be a toughness, and it's got to be tough love. And I would just say that, whilst we're going, oh, isn't it awful? How dreadful. For all of those Labour MPs who might think I'm going to go out with my socialist credentials burning, they've got a lot to answer for if Reform take on those seats afterwards. Because actually they will have done it. They will have allowed Reform to get in, and there will be a lot worse on the benefits. And the other thing I would say is that if you look across Europe, Germany in particular, and France too, there is a real surge of some sort of conscription maybe not conscription as enforceable, but a move to get young people fit and ready for fighting for a war that people, I think, generally feel is inevitable. And at the moment, we're spending more on welfare than we are on defence. But worse than that, we haven't got people who are fit enough, mentally or physically, to do anything if we had to go into a war effort.
Scary stuff.
Well,
Joe.
I mean, what an incredible thing. I mean, I'm not for a moment criticizing Joe for saying that, but I never thought in my lifetime I'd hear such a statement. I mean, she's right. She's right. She's sketched out the parameters. But let's just pause for a moment to think about what Joe's just said, that we need to be training our young people for possibly for a third episode of that awful sort of thing that we had with the two world wars. I mean, it's a a very, very interesting thing that Joe said there.
Happy Christmas, everyone. I think it's a serious point. I think that you would have a hell of a job in trying to reintroduce conscription into the UK. Rishi Sunak floated a sort of semi-conscription idea during the last election. He was absolutely pillory for it, wasn't it? You imagine all the middle-class mums up and down the country, and some of the dads looking at the school gates in our place. Bloody hell, the lads are worse than the girls now for getting mollycoddled. Honestly, nuts. So I'm not sure whether that's going to be something that they can fly a kite on, even, to be fair, unless they all got together. The whole political establishment came together and said that this is now critical, and we're going to have to start to get people conscripted again. Very, very tough. You've just said, Joe, people who are living in coastal towns can't get jobs in hospitality. God forbid they travel 20 miles up the road, to get a job. So imagine trying to get them into conscripted army. So we'll see. I got on my bike and looked for work. Get on your bike.
The famous Norman Tebbit reference to his father.
I ended up having to go to Leicester for a job, James, when I spent 6 months on the dole. So there you go. It does happen. People do have to travel for work sometimes, and it's not necessarily what you preach, but sometimes it's what's required. And we've got 800,000 vacancies in this country. So there are jobs out there. And people need to be encouraged and incentivized to get them. And hopefully Pat McFadden will come up with some solutions to what is an increasingly challenging problem, as Joe rightly says, will be resolved by the right wing one way or the other. And it won't be nice if reform certainly took the reins. Let's not forget, though, and I think it is easy for us to forget, that the reason we've got this crisis is because of austerity and 14 years of total mismanagement of the system. And you can say this across so many areas now, and it is very easy to criticise this government, and it's right to criticise this government in an awful lot of respects. But let's never forget the absolute mess, the chaos, the catastrophic impact that those 14 years of Conservative government had on this country's infrastructure, right across the board, whether you're talking about welfare, whether you're talking about transport, or indeed whether you're talking about our prison service. I mean, such is how busy we are in terms of the political conversation at the moment. We're not even talking about the scrapping of jury trials. Perhaps that's something we can look at next week, because I think that, again, as Liberals, ordinarily us three would have been up in arms over that, but I think we're all sat back thinking, what option have they got? As I say, maybe that's something we can come back to next week. Final thing I want to discuss today is the continued rumours of the return of Reina, and Angela has been in the news over the weekend, with Keir Starmer saying that he wants to welcome her back to the cabinet sooner rather than later. Apparently, she and Wes Streeting are having conversations about some sort of deal for a leadership contest that isn't happening yet. There's no vacancy, but there is a contest, as Jim always says. What are we making of this? Is Angela Rayner's return to government inevitable, Joe? I think it is, isn't it?
Yeah, she's too good. She's too talented to stay on the backbenches. It's a great shame that she was forced to resign, although, as we all agreed, it was a necessary thing at the time. But I think, she's really good. And it was a great shame that before she resigned, she wasn't used more. One of the weaknesses of this government is that Keir Starmer is abroad so much, doing brilliantly abroad. But if you haven't got a really good person as your deputy, which he hasn't at the moment, but he did have in Angela Rayner and didn't use her, actually things might have been different with hindsight. No, she's a skilled politician. She speaks human. People like her. Whether she comes back as leader or whether she just comes back to the cabinet, I think we're a long way off a leadership challenge. I don't think, however disappointing the government has turned out to be, the public do not have an appetite for constantly chopping and changing.
Jim, Angela Rayner's return. What about this idea of a pact between her and Wes Streeting?
Yes, well, you sort of think of the Tony Blair, John Prescott thing, but this would be slightly more awkward because those two individuals' politics are quite a lot different, but it would be quite a clever architecture. But as you've said, at the moment we're parking that because it's not likely to happen. Yeah, she is needed. She is authentic, and she was a victim of the boys' club culture around Morgan McSweeney, which I think imagine has taken a step back now that it's proved to be rather disastrous and rather embarrassing for the government. So I think she probably wouldn't face that sort of thing. I mean, I just ask, is there any concern about public cynicism about it? I think people generally thought that she hadn't taken enough care about her property arrangements and had to pay the price. But I mean, are the public forgiving? So 6 months is long enough for that, and then she can come back all guns blazing. I think probably people are pretty cynical about politicians, and it won't make a big difference. That's my only concern about it. But
it's very sad, isn't it, to say that people won't really care because they think they're all the same anyway, which is a sad place for us to be. I think the interesting thing when you talk to politicians across Parliament is that she's actually really well liked.
Yeah.
And so perhaps you can't imagine the Daily Mail and the Telegraph going easy on her, but I'm not sure she'll get the same sort of stick as other politicians might in those circumstances. And I think, generally speaking, people who have followed the story carefully will be aware that it was a cock-up rather than a deliberate attempt to dodge tax. Now, it was a bad cock-up, and it was one that obviously she's held her hands up to, and she's decided to resign, or the ethics guy said that she needed to resign. My view, in retrospect, is that she probably could have toughened it out. I think after a couple of weeks, we've seen this, haven't we? Look at the furore last week that we were talking about 7 days ago. Everybody was saying that Rachel Reeves totally misled the press and the public, and she'd lied. And I mean, Dan Hodges was calling for her to go to jail, for God's sake. This week, we haven't mentioned it. These things come and go very quickly now, don't they? So I'm not sure whether she'd have just said, if Starmer would have said, yes, she's made a cock-up, but actually, I've spoken to her. It was a cock-up. She's going to pay the money that she owes, and we're just going to crack on. And again, I wonder whether it comes back to this government being a bit too soft on certain things and far too loose-lipped around the press on matters that people, as Joe rightly said, sort of roll their eyes about. The Westminster bubble stuff that gets us all excited. And Number 10 seemed great at being able to get those stories out into the press, but very poor at getting things out that matter to people. And somebody was saying to me, I think it was probably at that reception on Wednesday, the government had made over 3,000 announcements since coming into government. And a lot of those things, we would all say, wow, that's really good, that's really positive. Nobody knows about them because they've almost been obsessed with the internal machinations of what the Parliamentary Labour Party and the wider party are doing. And I do think, sadly, that goes back to what Morgan McSweeney is probably good at, which is sorting out internal party matters. But that doesn't mean he's great at the outward facing stuff. And again, looking ahead to the new year, I wonder whether Keir Starmer needs to not just bring Angela Rayner back, but get that number 10 office sorted out, make it a bit more effective and a bit more punchy. We'll have to wait and see. But for me, yeah, Angela will be back. Sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned. But that will mean another reshuffle. And what does he bring her back as, Joe? Does he say to Mr. Lammy, well, we've seen how you perform at Prime Minister's questions, mate. So you need to bugger off and just focus on justice.
I mean,
what would he do? What would he do?
Could she come back as Chancellor? Could Rachel be persuaded to?
The markets would absolutely go ballistic if we brought Angela Rayner in as Chancellor.
They will find something for her to come back to do, I'm sure. I mean, David Lammy was a terrible appointment for Justice and as Deputy Prime Minister. You could see perhaps Jonathan Reynolds being moved somewhere else and Angela Rayner coming back as Chief Whip temporarily until there is another portfolio to take over. I mean, all the people who are in position at the moment aren't doing too badly, although Yvette Cooper is completely in the shadow of Keir Starmer, who seems to be doing a very good job as Foreign Secretary. And I think,
that happens, to be fair, though, because we've had a little bit of a kick at Keir over his never
he's really good. He's done brilliantly.
Not only has he done really well, Joe, but you look back and other than perhaps Gordon Brown, didn't most prime ministers end up being seen as the foreign secretary de facto anyway?
Yes, no, that is absolutely fair. But also, I mean, Keir Starmer has inherited the world in turmoil. And actually, if you're going to have meetings with other heads of state, you don't send David Lammy or Angela Rayner, who is in that position. Yeah. You actually have to go if it's Trump and it's Macron or it's Carney.
Do you know what I'd do with her? I would sack Ed Miliband and I'd give her the net zero job.
No, people like Ed Miliband. And, the people who are really into that believe in him because he really pushes for it and he believes in it. I mean, I think he's, I don't think
therein lies the problem. You've got a bloody politician who believes in stuff.
Can I do my reshuffle?
Really?
Well, Go on,
reshuffle it. Well, I think she needs her old job, but I think anything else doesn't really fit. Housing and local government and that sort of thing. Give her old job back. Steve Reid, no one's hardly heard of him. He's out. Lammy's out. Cooper's out as Foreign Secretary. I haven't got the people to come in yet, but that's my reshuffle.
Yeah, he's like Night for the Long Lives.
Night of the Long Lives.
I tell you, Jim, Steve Reid is doing a great job.
He's great.
Okay. Honestly, Steve Reid, on a serious note, Steve Reid, I think, is doing a great job. And he's focused, laser focused on the housing agenda to the point where I think that legislation will move forward in the new year. The one criticism I've had of Angela in the role that she took was it was too broad and she wasn't getting a grip of that housing crisis in the way in which Steve Reid has. Local government reorganisation is all over the place. They've just cancelled 4 mayoral elections next year. Now, part of that will be political, but part of it is because these local authorities in those areas just ain't got their act together. Nobody at Westminster or Whitehall has got to grips with it. So I think it was too broad an agenda that Angela was trying to stay across it all. I do think that we should try and find a way to bring her back as Deputy Prime Minister. Now, whether or not that role requires a much broader thing. What about Leader of the House?
Well, you
Wouldn't
could
that
do that,
work?
but it's a bit of a downgrade for her. The other thing, of course, is that the
Deputy
Home
Prime
Office.
Minister and Leader of the House. Would that be a downgrade?
Mm,
You know, you just need her
yeah,
out
but what do you do?
campaigning,
Yeah,
don't
but
you? You need
you'd have to
her
do, you'd
to
have to do
be
something with Lammy.
2 years before an election. You need Angela Rayner to be free to go onto the airwaves, talk about almost anything, which Deputy Prime Minister title gives you. Leader of the House gets you into the cabinet.
Or Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. That's another
Yeah.
portfolio that
You could do that, or you split
has
the
a
Home
northern ring
Office.
to it.
You split the Home Office and you let Shabana concentrate on the sort of, the really big things like immigration and stuff like that, and you let Angela work alongside Ministry of Justice on things like probation and the sort of social side of a housing Home Office. I mean, there are ways to do it. But maybe,
well, she'll be back anyway, won't she?
She'll be back, but
we'll decide. I mean, Jim, Jim's got about 93 vacancies to fill, so she's definitely going to be back.
Fantasy Cabinet with Jim Hancock. Nobody's in it apart from him.
Read Lammy and Cooper for the exit door, along with Tom cleverly.
Right. Well, on that note, as I say, Angela will be back, and Joe and I will be back next Monday, but Jim won't be. We're not sacking him. He's just gone to yet another break, and that triple lock, it's burning a hole in his pocket. So he's away next week. He's off to, where are you going to? Oh no, I think
I'm
he's got an
visiting
appointment.
an elderly relative in Sheffield.
Okay, I thought you had an appointment at Specsavers because they do hearing aids now as well. There you go. We should contact. In fact, I'm going to get our producer Francesca to contact Specsavers after this podcast and see if we can get a few bob out of them for giving them
a very
plug.
good optician in Urmston.
Right.
Can we
So
not use Jim as a poster
Thomas
boy?
Carter, very good.
right, shut up. Let's get on with the programme and finish and say thank you very much to our listeners once again for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this ragtag and bobtail of an episode. False starts, stories in the middle that totally threw me, and we didn't even talk about Jim basically standing Joe up on Thursday, throwing her over
The
top.
Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson,
Oh,
stood
come
us
on,
up.
Jim, we know.
Oh,
that
yes.
it's-
Actually, she should be another one for the exit door, just because she spoiled my lunch with Joe.
Bloody hell, there's no one left in the government. Anyway, next week, as I say, Joe and I will be back to try and bring some sanity back to the podcast. But let me just say one final thing to our very loyal listeners. If you have any questions, of which I have had several on my travels, and we'll be putting them to our esteemed Joe and Jim in a couple of weeks' time, please do let us know. We'll be having a bit of fun. It doesn't have to be all politics. We can ask some interesting personal questions about why Jim's obsessed with Plymouth Argyle and why Joe gets up at 4 o'clock every morning, takes to the waves on a little dinghy. We can ask anything you want. So do that. And as I say, we'll be back in 7 days' time. Thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of your week.